Hello, everybody. In the new year, it seems everything old is new again, particularly in international relations. Uh, Increasingly, we live in a great power world. Donald Trump is planning a new U.S. empire. He's not even ashamed to describe it in that way. He wants to, at least according to The Nation, of course, who are not his biggest fan, make colonialism great again. Meanwhile, the Russian colonial war or neo-colonial war in Ukraine continues, and the Russians and the Americans are involved in all sorts of subterfuge. The Americans, according to the Russians, are vowing retaliation after supposedly downing 8 US-made long missiles. And of course, the third great power in the world today is China, and it's possible, although chilling, that there may be another war or conflict over Taiwan. The old is new again, and we live in a great power world, and there's a new book out on great powers called A Measure Short of War. It's co-authored by Jill Kastner and William Wolforth. And Jill Kastner is joining us from Barbados today. Not a great power, Jill.
No, not at all.
Are you fleeing nuclear war? Are you bunkering down out there?
I'm having a brief respite from the English winter.
So you had an interesting piece in Foreign Affairs, which is adapted from the book, suggesting that everything old is new again. Is that true? Are we returning to classic 19th century great power international politics?
Well, I wouldn't even say 19th century. I would say that the great power politics and the subversive element of it, which is what we focus on, has characteristics that have been coming along since recorded history. So, yes, everything old is new again. The tactics and the goals of subversive action that we look at haven't changed over time. And what we see as a return of great power politics is actually a return to normality. And I can elaborate on that if you think of, we can talk about that at length later whenever you want to get to it. But there were 25 years where the US was the big dog, the unipolar era. So from our perspective, what's happening now is a return to normality, really. You could argue whether we're in a multipolar world or in some sort of a hybrid between unipolar and shifting towards multipolar, but it is not the US being the big dog in the neighborhood again in the way that it was before.
So your book is called A Measure Short of War, A Brief History of Great Power Subversion. Jill, in this return to normalcy, at least in international politics, when you have great powers like the United States, Russia, and China, is subversion inevitable, unavoidable? Have there ever been any, and the book is a history in many ways, have there been any moments in history where you've had great power systems where there isn't subversion?
If we ever had one, it would have been very briefly after the fall of the Soviet Union. What we did with the book was in 2016, both of us noticed that the sort of febrile reaction that everyone was happening to the Russian meddling seemed really overblown. And so we decided to go back and look at the kind of activities that people associate with subversion. So propaganda, disinformation, bribery, funding opposition groups, all that kind of stuff, and going on to sabotage and assassination and regime change. We decided to go back and look at as much of history as we could and get a sense of where subversive action fits within traditional statecraft. So you've got diplomacy, and you've got balancing, and you've got subversion, and then you've got war. So instead of looking at it as a malign behavior or as somehow bad or naughty, we decided it deserved to be treated like a tool. So if you look at it that way and treat it as a tool of statecraft, then first of all, you can have a much more unemotional approach to it when you're trying to figure out what to do about it. And second of all, you get much more perspective on what the tools might be and what the motivations might be so that you can deal with it.
Many years ago, Jill, I studied international relations at Berkeley with a couple of professors, one who was an idealist, Richard Haas, the other who was perhaps the father of, or one of the fathers of IR realism, Ken Waltz. Are the assumptions in your book a measure short of war, this focus on great power subversion? Are you very much in the realist school of IR thinking? Do you take it for granted that all powers seek more power and definitely, inevitably, unavoidably bump into the interests of other powers? Does this make it a realist track, a realist way of thinking about international politics?
I think it's more realist than anything else. But it's very much based on the idea that there can be an equilibrium, just because when you think about subversive activity, states decide they make a cost benefit calculation like anyone else when they decide whether to have a go at subversion or not. And the idea is that there's a rational thought process behind that. So if you think of why a state would decide to try and subvert its rival, if diplomacy isn't working, if they're frustrated, if they need to make some sort of a gain, you would try subversion because it's cheap and it's flexible and it's deniable most of the time. That's a very sort of realistic approach to it. There's realism as an IR realism, but part of this is also just being very pragmatic about trying to make a foreign policy gain without getting into a hot war. So the reason the book is called Measures Short of War is it's about all the activities that you can have between diplomacy and war itself. So trying to make a gain, either to shift the foreign policy of your rival or to weaken it, and it is very much a cost benefit calculation. So yes, definitely in the realist camp.
In America, as you know, I know you're based in the UK, but you're originally American. You did your graduate work in America. Americans tend to think of foreign policy, perhaps like many great powers, in highly moralistic terms. So, for example, Ukraine, the meddling that America is involved in, apparently supplying long-range missiles to the Ukrainians, is thought of in moral terms. Is there always a moral quality? And no doubt from the Russian point of view, represents the other kind of moral side of the coin. Is morality involved in these measures short of war and subversion? Is it always a way of selling policy to your domestic audience? Although, of course, sometimes, especially when it comes to secret initiatives, I guess subversion isn't even well known.
Well, it's interesting because there's an argument that the norm of sovereignty is supposed to prevent subversion. So our definition of subversion is hostile or unwanted action on the territory of your rival, with the goal of getting effects, changing foreign policy, or weakening the rival. So just trying to think about this. Can I pause this?
Thinking. Are you thinking hard, Jill?
I'm thinking hard. Can you tell me the question again? Tell me the question again.
My question was about the way in which perhaps subversion, or the act of subversion by great powers, is sold to a domestic audience. I mean, of course, America is a democracy, so there's a lot more selling done in the US perhaps than there is in China or Russia. But at the same time, powers need to sell their policy, if the policies are overt, to their domestic audiences. So yes. Is subversion mostly done in the language, in the name of morality?
Well, good subversion is not publicized at all, the bulk of it. So subversion, you can have overt subversion, you can have covert, and you can have violent. But normally, it's not a moral issue. It's the morality thing, that those norms of sovereignty, and the moral thing only holds as long as it's practical. So we've come into an age, for instance, where it's seen as bad to meddle in other countries. But when you get to something like democracy promotion or human rights promotion, suddenly that is a transnational idea that lets you justify meddling. So if you look at what happened in say in Russia or in the former Soviet states in the 90s, there was a lot of democracy promotion, which from our perspective was
through networks like Radio Free Europe, which you write about in your foreign affairs piece.
Yes, but even beyond that, so something called the National Endowment for Democracy, which is still functional, which was created.
Yeah, I know those guys. There's a Republican and a Democratic wing of it, even.
Yes. So the National Endowment for Democracy was created in the Reagan administration, and it was designed to kind of take those moral precepts, those good ideas, and promote them wherever they could be promoted. But then once the Soviet Union fell apart, it was very easy for those kinds of NGOs and democracy promotion and freedom of speech promoting organizations, labor organizations, women's rights, all that kind of stuff, to be very active in the former Soviet states. And it looked morally wonderful from our perspective. It was, it was promoting everything that we believed in, and it seemed that prosperity and democracy and the liberal ideals that we'd been fighting for throughout the Cold War had suddenly won and were being accepted and promoted. But the problem is that from the other side, eventually that became less and less tenable, especially after Putin came to power. So the morality of it, one person's morality is another person's subversion and their subversive perspective.
Well, they turn it around for their own moral benefit. You live. You're in Barbados at the moment, but you live in the UK, the land of John le Carré and George Smiley, who everybody, I hope, watching will know about. When it comes to great power subversion, are the secret services that le Carré wrote about and George Smiley was a fictional hero of, are they the main vehicles for this subversion? In the US, of course, it's the CIA, maybe the FBI in a sense, but mostly the CIA. Russia, of course, has whole buildings, probably whole cities, or certainly streets and neighborhoods dedicated to this.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, that's what intelligence services do. That's part of their remit. So they would be in charge of a lot of the aspects of this, of having disinformation campaigns or covert funding for opposition groups, all the kinds of things that happen in the rivals' territory. But at the same time, there's some overt things that happen as well that are not necessarily orchestrated by the intelligence services. And the NED and the Democratic and Republican institutes overseas are an example of that. Sometimes there's a little bit of commingling of funds and activities. So, for instance, in the Balkans, so in Kosovo, in the Serbian elections in 2000, for instance, you had a lot of the American NGOs on the ground, but you also had CIA funding for the opposition groups against Milosevic. So it gets really murky when everybody's involved, and it's probably better if it's kept separate between the NGOs and those sort of more overt activist groups.
Yeah, but I mean, murkiness, of course, is the distinguishing feature of George Smiley. Or at least le Carré made art out of murkiness. In terms of this title of your book, A Measure Short of War, are you suggesting that by definition, subversion needs to be designed to avoid war, or certainly great power war? And in that sense, perhaps the model to avoid, the warning model, would be the great power system before the First World War, where nobody quite wanted war. Every great power, and there were 5 or 6 of them, or some greater than others, were all subverting others for one reason or another. Nobody wanted war, and then there was this catastrophic war which destroyed the great power system in the European world. So is this measure short of war, is this always known by the actors, by the subverters?
But the subversion's it doesn't lead to the war. It can be a little spark, but obviously there are bigger currents that are leading to that. The subversion can actually serve. It can serve as a pressure valve in some ways. So, for instance, if you've got two countries that are really at odds, and you've got a group in the foreign policy bureaucracy in one of them that really wants some action. Sometimes humans just want some action. They can try a little subversion and it'll be a pinprick. It may do absolutely nothing, but they can go back to their bosses and they can say, we're doing something. They can feel like they're giving their adversary a black eye, but it won't be something that is egregious enough to spark a hot war. And an example of this would be sort of in the late 40s, right after the end of World War II, as the Soviet Union was consolidating that bloc in Eastern Europe, and the US was consolidating and trying to avoid creating a permanent presence in Western Europe. The idea was that the US would have some really kinetic subversive activities, funding and supporting insurgents in Ukraine and in Moldova, and attempting a little bit on Soviet territory itself, but never being able to really get that far. It just doesn't really work in the end. It's a pinprick, but it gives people.
What about, back to my example of the First World War? Could that be used as an argument suggesting that sometimes the great powers screw up, and their subversion does indeed lead to war? Which nobody really wants, and certainly nobody wanted the First World War.
Yeah, nobody ever wants a war, really. Do they really want a war?
Well, I mean, Hitler clearly wanted a war.
Well, but Hitler, he wanted to get away with it without a war. So he used a hybrid operation, if you think about it, in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, similar to what Putin has done in Ukraine. An attempt to make those gains without actually having to resort to war.
But I mean, comparing Hitler and Putin, I mean, Hitler got away with it in the Sudetenland, and then he invaded Poland. At a certain point, he recognized that war was inevitable. I mean, he certainly didn't. He didn't intend his invasion of Poland to be a measure short of war, did he?
No. But I'm just comparing the activity itself. Thinking of what we're talking about is using the idea of subversion as a tool of statecraft. So if you're a state, a leader. And diplomacy isn't working, and economic blandishments are not working. Nothing is working. You're frustrated. The issue, whatever it is of such vital importance to you that you can't let it go. So for Putin, Ukraine would have been that. For Hitler, the Lebensraum, whatever, all those issues that he was working on. If it gets to that point, then subversion is something that you can try to make the gains that you need without having to resort to war. And it doesn't always work. Sometimes subversion is a way station on the way to war.
And would that be the case with the First World War? I keep on bringing this back.
Oh, you would look at the First World War. Yeah, but you could, yes, but it's not really causal. So if you think of the First World War, the tensions that were creating the pathway to that conflict, when those tensions begin to become exacerbated, you begin to see more and more subversion as just the underhanded activity.
Well, yeah. So would and obviously this is still a matter of great debate, but would the Serbian support or investment in the assassination of the Austrian Archduke in Sarajevo in 1914, do you think of that as subversion? And of course, the Serbians weren't a great power, but certainly Russia's willingness to implicitly support what the Serbs were doing, is that an example of a measure short of war?
Yes, it is. Yes, it's an example of subversion, but it's more. That's not really the great power subversion idea of one power deliberately going after another. So when we go through the book, we're sort of looking at just the big powers in order to understand the dynamic, not only between the big powers, but also between the big powers and the small powers. So that would be, a case where miscalculation was all around. They would have been much better to just kick the can down the road. But given the alliances, we all know how that ended up.
But it's always easy in retrospect. Who are your great heroes of subversion? I know you wrote about Elizabeth I, the great late 16th century English monarch, the first, the woman who made Britain a great power, certainly a European power, world power, and Bismarck, who's often thought of as the quintessential player of the great game. Are those both examples of statespeople who know how to subvert without going to war?
Absolutely, both of them. Bismarck much more proactive in a sense that he was already the statesman at the helm of the country that had won the Franco-Prussian War. So the examples that we use in the book are just in the aftermath of that, where he was trying to make sure that France did not come under a monarchy again. He preferred a republican government because he thought it would be much more advantageous to Germany and prevent the French trying to relitigate the war, revanchism. So he was quite strong. Elizabeth I, that whole episode between Elizabeth I and Philip II of Spain that chapter focuses on just that couple, because you can watch their relationship and kind of see how first they tried diplomacy. Diplomacy didn't work. Philip was originally married to Elizabeth's half sister, and he was the titular king of England. And when Mary died, Philip lost the title of king of England. He lost England to the Protestants, and he lost he lost England for all of the Habsburg fold as well. So it was a religious, it was an imperial and a religious and a familial sort of loss. So in his efforts to get England back into the Habsburg fold, he preferred to marry Elizabeth, diplomacy. And they tried that for about 10 years with various negotiations between Philip and Elizabeth and between various other Habsburg princes. And as long as diplomacy was an option, he didn't engage in any of the stuff that he did later, which was, funding rebellion and regicide and sending Catholics into the country to try and rise up and murder the Queen. That came much later, when the diplomatic efforts had been thwarted. So you can see how, the state that's the subverter wants something, doesn't get what it wants, doesn't want to resort to war, or has constraints against resorting to war, and so uses all these measures short of war to get what it needs or what it wants.
And ultimately, of course, he did resort to war, a disastrous war, the Armada, which was defeated. Yeah. Well, who are the great theorists then of the principles? I know you write about the Greek historian, perhaps the father of history itself, Thucydides, or certainly international history, and the Chinese general and strategist Sun Tzu. Are they both good examples, Thucydides and Sun Tzu, of theorists of measures short of war?
Well, I wouldn't call them theorists, but I would say they give us a written record of examples in the past that let us see that our ancestors behaved much as we do today. So Thucydides, there's a lot of, after Graham Allison wrote the book Thucydides Trap, there's a lot of talk about the rise of Sparta and the rise of Athens pushing back, and Sparta needing to resort to war to keep Athens from rising. And if you read the passages in Thucydides, there's talk about subversion. So this is one of the things that we mentioned. When there's a weakness, a sudden exogenous shock for the country, in this case it was an earthquake in 464 BC in Sparta, and they had an uprising of the Helots. This is a slave population, and so there was a weakness, and the Spartans feared that the Athenians would come in and encourage the Helots and support them in their uprising and overthrow Sparta. So it was the rise of Athens, yes, but it was also the fear of what Athens would do with the power and with its subversive power, given this sort of, not a fifth column, but this big potential ticking time bomb in Sparta in the form of the Helot population. So that's a really good example. And Sun Tzu, he's got all sorts of wonderful comments on, how to conduct good warfare. And there's all kinds of.
I'm guessing, Jill, that Xi in Beijing reads is more likely to read Sun Tzu than a certain Donald Trump is going to read Thucydides. Do you think?
I think that's probably true.
Although probably Trump is, I mean, he fancies himself in everything. He always thinks he's the best, but he's the ultimate realist in everything he does. So he's probably intuitively not bad at subversion, is he? I mean, I'm less, in some ways, I think I'm less nervous of some sort of terrible global nuclear war under him than I would be under Biden or Harris. Is that fair, or am I being over optimistic?
I think it's probably 6 and 1 and half dozen the other. I think the chances aren't really high for either one. The nice thing about Trump is that if you're going to get into a tough guy contest with the other tough guys in the neighborhood, if you've got a tough guy who's also seen as a little bit erratic, a little bit crazy, it helps your case. It puts a little bit of fear, I think, in the minds of the adversaries. In terms of Trump as subversion, I mean, I think that's it's probably something for the intelligence agencies.
Yeah, I think he's instinctively a subversive character who's probably watching this and trying to destroy you and I. What about nuclear weapons? Do they change everything or anything when it comes to this? One of Trump's ambitions, I guess, is to try and establish some sort of arrangement with North Korea. North Korea is anything but a great power, except that it does have nuclear weapons. So does the existence of weapons of genuine mass destruction, often I think that term is misused, but when it comes to nuclear weapons, they are weapons of mass destruction. Does that change anything about subversion, or are the rules really the same?
I think it would. I think it probably encourages more of it because you're less likely to do anything kinetic, and it may also keep it more in the direction of information operations. So more towards disinformation, propaganda, and all the social media stuff, because you don't want to, this that cost benefit analysis thing. You don't want to push it to the point where your adversary really thinks it should retaliate. I think it would take a lot to provoke North Korea to provoke anybody to launch a nuclear weapon, because I think they all recognize what the repercussions are. But the subversive activity will continue. That's exactly where it does happen. I mean, that's why the U.S. had to stop its rollback policies in the late 40s, because they were afraid that they would actually provoke a hot war with the Soviets. I don't know if they were afraid it would be a nuclear war, but it was probably much more likely then than it is now, because it was all sort of new and scary because a bomb had actually been dropped.
Yeah, and the closest, of course, that the U.S. and Russia came to a full-blown nuclear, certainly a confrontation, maybe even war, was over Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that came on the heels of the Bay of Pigs, which was perhaps the most embarrassing chapter in post-war American foreign policy. Whereas the Cuban Missile Crisis, I've been reading about it recently, is that an example of perhaps the Kennedys? They couldn't, of course, read your book because it wasn't around then, but did they do exactly what you suggested, which is subvert to the point of war? Or does the Cuban Missile Crisis reflect better on Khrushchev and his use of subversion to undermine America?
Well, I think I wouldn't even, in my mind, I don't even think about the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of subversion. Bay of Pigs, yes, because that's like an armed insurrection, and that's a subversive activity. But for the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a reaction from Khrushchev after the U.S. stationed Jupiter missiles in Turkey. So if we could put missiles in Turkey that could reach Moscow in a certain amount of time, then Cuba was sort of the equivalent. And I think that's where that came from.
So it wasn't a form of subversion; it was a form of self-defense. But aren't you trusting Khrushchev on that one?
It was a form of sort of power projection, and the great eternal Russian need to be, the great power, to push that. That's Putin as well, and so for Khrushchev, the fact that they could negotiate the end of that very quietly and it was very tense, as you know. But yes, the Soviets did decide to stand down, and the missiles were very quietly removed from Turkey. I think the following year or some months later, at some point a little further down the road after the dust had settled. So that to me, I'm sure there was all sorts of things going on behind the scenes, but that's not really. That's much more of an overt military confrontation, which is, that sort of signaling. That's
Well, is that true then? I mean, if in that way of thinking, if indeed the Ukraine is using US-made long-range missiles to fire at Russia or Russian forces, is that closer to the Cuban Missile Crisis than the subversion you write about in your book?
Yes, I mean that's a military conflict, and we try and focus on what happens before you get to the point of war. So once you've crossed the line into warfare, yes, subversion happens all the time in warfare. That's just part of it, um, because then the gloves are off. The less you have to lose, the more likely you are to subvert. And if you're at war with somebody, you've already lost all the trust. You don't need their trust because you're not interested in collaborating.
Well, let's
So
end, Jill, with your advice to American foreign policy people, the CIA and the State Department people, on both Ukraine and Taiwan. What should America do as a measure short of war, which won't risk war, both in Ukraine and where there is a real war, a Russian invasion, and in Taiwan, where there is this ongoing threat promised from China of somehow becoming involved in Taiwan? What would you advise and what would you warn against?
Well, I would say, dealing with subversion, and that's why we thought about it in this way in this book. It's the point is to have a dispassionate approach to it so that you can defend. And so diplomacy and deterrence and defense are really important. It's important to keep diplomatic options open, to keep that as one of the arrows in your quiver, even when things get really, really bad. Defense and deterrence, technical, cyber, all the things that are happening now to protect against cyber intrusions, to protect against drone intrusions. There's technological stuff that's happening, new companies creating new technologies to protect against the attacks of the present and the future. All of that has to be kept up at a very high level of resilience and preparedness that we're not used to, in the U.S. especially, because we had that long 25-year stint of being the top dog, and so we're not used to that vigilance. That's something that we need to work on. It's the same thing for Taiwan, for anybody who's in the crosshairs of a great power trying to subvert them, or of any power trying to subvert them, is to be aware, to not be apathetic, to work on the vulnerabilities in your own society, because that's where the foreign adversary will come and poke a probe and do their best to make a gain. It's really important to focus on affairs at home, because you create your own vulnerabilities with subversion.
And finally, Jill, should we celebrate the return of great power politics? Some people think it gives us more security and certainty. There are always going to be wars. I mean, one interpretation is the catastrophe in the Middle East, in Syria, and particularly Israel, Palestine, is because there's either one power or the absence of powers. Might a measure short of war, this brief history of subversion that you write about in your new book, might that be a means of keeping the peace, and it's something that we actually should celebrate?
I think we could celebrate a return to a more multipolar or varied world, because that's the world we live in. It was a real anomaly to have one country be a hegemon. All the countries have been fighting against the hegemon forever. When one country gets that powerful, everyone else has them in their sights, and so it's a very dangerous place to be. So I think it's a good thing to be back, and I think that subversion is a fact of life, and that's why we wrote about this. It is a tool of statecraft. It's a fact of life. It will always be there. We need to not get upset by it. We need to be vigilant. We need to prepare ourselves for it so that we can push back when we need to and use it for our own purposes when we need to.
Well, there you have it. Subversion is a fact of life, according to Jill Kastner, at least, the co-author of A Measure Short of War, A Brief History of Great Power Subversion. Tend to be sympathetic. Some people might disagree, but it's an important position in early 2025 when we seem to be returning to great power politics. So, Jill, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
And as long as we don't have nuclear war in the short term, we'll have to have you back on the show to see how our great power era is unfolding. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.